Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Carter grabbed Sergeant Brooks by the collar and slammed him against the equipment table so hard the $3,000 ballistic computer shattered on the concrete floor. 200 rounds. Carter's face was an inch from Brooks' face veins splitting across his forehead like fault lines. 200 rounds and not one single hit. You call yourself a Marine sniper, you're a disgrace to this uniform. He shoved Brooks backward. The younger man stumbled. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 20 feet away, a woman in a gray maintenance uniform kept sweeping the floor without looking up. Nobody noticed her. That was the worst mistake Daniel Carter ever made. If this story hits something deep inside you, subscribe to our channel right now. Drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Mojave Desert in late October did not forgive anything. Not bad decisions, not arrogance, and certainly not bad shooting. The sun pressed down on the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center at 29 Palms, California, like a hand pushing everything flat against the earth. The mountain ridges in the distance shimmered and wavered in the heat, and the air tasted like chalk and hot iron. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Carter stood at the command post behind the firing line and watched his team fail for the 237th time. He knew the exact number because he had been counting. He counted everything. He counted rounds expended, seconds, wasted adjustments, made recalculations entered into the system. He counted because counting gave him the illusion of control, and right now control was the one thing completely absent from this training exercise. The target was a standard steel plate, 18 inches wide, mounted on a frame at approximately 1,700 yards, just under a mile. For a qualified Marine Scout sniper, that distance was considered long, but achievable. The best shooters in the world could hit targets at twice that range under the right conditions. This was not supposed to be the hard part. This was supposed to be the easy warm-up before the real evaluation began. Sergeant Michael Brooks, the team's primary shooter and arguably one of the finest natural marksmen Carter had ever trained, pressed his eye to the scope and called his wind. 8 miles per hour coming left to right at the 300-yard mark, Brooks said. His voice was flat and professional. Adjusting for elevation. Round is going. The rifle fired. The sound rolled across the valley like a door slamming in an empty house. Silence. The steel target did not move, did not ring, did not give any indication that a bullet had come anywhere close to it. Miss, called the spotter. Brooks pulled back from the scope and looked at his partner. Corporal James Reyes, with an expression that mixed confusion with something darker. Tell me you saw the trace, Brooks said. Reyes shook his head slowly. I caught it at about 400 yards. It started pulling hard left, way too hard for the wind we clocked. That's because we're not reading the same wind the bullet's traveling through, Brooks said almost to himself. He didn't say it loudly. He wasn't trying to make a point. He was genuinely trying to work through a problem that his training didn't have a clean answer for. Carter heard it anyway. What was that, Sergeant? Brooks straightened slightly the way all Marines do when a superior's voice takes on that particular edge. I said the ballistic read might not be capturing the full wind profile downrange, Gunny. The bullet's acting like it's hitting a crosswind we're not seeing. Carter walked over slowly. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, thick in the forearms, with a face that had spent too many years in too many unforgiving climates. When he moved, other men paid attention, not out of respect alone, but out of something closer to instinct. He looked through his own spotting scope for a long moment, then stood back up. The computer says the wind is reading correctly, Carter said. Yes, Gunny. You trust the computer. I trust the data, Gunny, but data is only as good as what we can measure, and there might be something between here and that target we're not measuring. Carter looked at him for a moment. Reset and fire again. That had been 2 hours ago. Now, with the sun dropping toward the western ridge and the temperature beginning its sharp desert slide toward cold, the team had expended enough ammunition to seriously concern the range officer and had produced a total of 0 hits on a target that should have been, by any reasonable measure, a straightforward exercise. The pressure was not abstract. This was a pre-deployment evaluation. The team was scheduled to rotate overseas in 11 days into an environment where long-range observation and precision fire were not training exercises, they were survival tools. The word coming down from battalion was clear: qualify or don't deploy. And right now, they weren't qualifying. Carter was standing behind the firing line with his hands on his hips and his jaw set like concrete when his radio crackled with the voice of the range safety officer. Gunny Carter, we're burning daylight and burning rounds. What's the status? Carter pressed the transmit button. Still working the problem. You've been working the problem for 3 hours. Is there a mechanical issue with the weapons? Carter looked at the rifles laid out on the table. His armorer had checked them twice. The scopes were zeroed. The ammunition was within spec. There was nothing mechanically wrong. Negative, Carter said. No mechanical issues. A pause on the radio, then, understood, you've got 90 minutes before we lose the light. Carter set the radio down and turned to his team. He looked at each of them in turn. Brooks Reyes, then the 4 other shooter-spotter pairs, who had all tried and all failed. Their expressions ranged from frustrated concentration to something approaching desperation. These were not men who failed easily. They were not men who accepted failure quietly. The silence in that team was the loudest kind, the kind that comes when pride is being eaten alive from the inside. All right, Carter said. Someone tell me something I don't already know, because what I know right now is that 12 trained Marine snipers cannot hit a target that a competent civilian hunter should be able to hit from this distance. Someone explain that to me in a way that doesn't make all of us look like we've never held a rifle. Nobody spoke immediately. Then Brooks raised his hand slightly. Not a full raise, more like a gesture, the way a man signals something when he's not entirely sure if what he's about to say is going to help or make things worse. Gunny, I've been thinking about the mirage patterns downrange. The way the heat is bending off the terrain between us and the target, it's not uniform. It's shifting in layers. And if the wind is doing the same thing, moving at different speeds and different directions at different altitudes, then our single point wind measurement is giving us a number that's correct at the point we're measuring, but completely wrong everywhere else along the flight path. Carter stared at him. So what are you saying? I'm saying the bullet might be traveling through 4 or 5 completely different wind environments between here and the target, and we're trying to account for all of them with one number. And that's why every single round is pulling the same direction. We're compensating for the surface wind. We're not seeing what's happening further up the valley. It was a reasonable analysis. It was, in fact, a correct analysis. The problem was that none of the technology available to them was designed to measure what Brooks was describing. The Kestrel weather meter on the table read surface conditions with excellent precision. The advanced ballistic computer integrated those readings with atmospheric data and calculated trajectories that were accurate to within fractions of a millimeter under standard conditions. But standard conditions assumed a relatively uniform wind environment, and the mountain valley beyond the firing line was producing anything but that. Carter absorbed what Brooks had said. He turned it over. He was not a man who dismissed ideas simply because they were inconvenient. He had gotten where he was by being honest with himself about what he didn't know, even when that honesty was uncomfortable. Can you compensate for that? Carter asked. Not with what we have, Gunny. Not without being able to read the wind at multiple points simultaneously downrange. We'd need someone out there who could watch the environment across the whole flight path and call it in real time. We don't have that. No, Gunny, we don't. Carter picked up a bottle of water, took a long drink, and set it back down. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. Around him, the team had gone still in the way experienced soldiers go still when they're waiting for a leader to make a decision they know isn't going to be comfortable. What Carter said next surprised all of them. Okay, I want every man to stop what he's doing and really look at this valley. Not through a scope, not at a screen, just look. Tell me what you actually see. The men looked at each other briefly, then turned toward the range. They looked out across the desert terrain, the scrub brush, the scattered rocks, the flat yellow grass, the distant ridgeline, the steel target barely visible at this distance as a small, dark shape against the hillside. After 30 seconds, Carter asked, "What do you see?" Answers came slowly. Dust moving left close in. The grass over near the berm looks like it's going the other direction. There's a heat shimmer about halfway down. The mirage is bending sideways, not straight up. Carter nodded. Keep going. The flag at the 1,000-yard marker is barely moving. But the flag at the 500-yard marker is going pretty hard to the right. Those two flags can't both be right, Reyes said, frowning. The wind can't be going opposite directions at the same time. Yes, it can, said a voice that did not belong to any of them. Everyone turned. The woman in the gray maintenance uniform had stopped sweeping. She was standing about 15 feet behind the firing line, holding a push broom, with both hands looking out at the range with a completely neutral expression. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't apologetic. She wasn't doing the thing that most civilians did when they accidentally said something in the presence of military personnel. She wasn't immediately backpedaling or adding qualifiers. She was just standing there looking at the valley with calm, focused eyes. Carter turned to face her fully. His expression was not kind. "Excuse me." "It can," she said again calmly. "Wind doesn't move in one uniform direction over varied terrain. It moves in channels. The mountain draws air down along the ridgeline and the flat valley floor heats unevenly, which creates its own circulation. You've got at least 3 different air masses interacting in the space between here and your target. The flags you're reading are all accurate. They're just reading different layers." Dead silence. Carter stared at her. He had a very specific look he used on people who said things he found ridiculous, and he used it now. It was a look that had made Lance Corporals reconsider career choices. "I'm sorry, and you are?" "Parker, Emily Parker, government contractor. I maintain the range equipment." "You maintain the range equipment." "That's correct." "And you know about layered wind systems and differential air circulation." "I know what I see," she said simply. One of the snipers, Corporal Denny Walsh, a compact man from Louisiana who had been on the team for 6 years and who operated primarily through a combination of bravado and genuine talent, made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a scoff. "Gunny, she cleans the targets. No offense, ma'am." Emily Parker did not look at Walsh. She kept looking at the range. "None taken," she said. Carter took one step toward her. "Mr. Parker, I appreciate the input, but my team has years of formal training in environmental reading and ballistics. Whatever you think you're seeing, I think I'm seeing what's pushing every round you fire about 4 feet left at the 1,300-yard mark, where the second air channel cuts across the valley floor at roughly 45 degrees. It's inconsistent because the thermal heating is changing hour to hour as the sun angle drops, so your compensation that worked 2 hours ago won't work now, and your compensation now won't work in 30 minutes. She finally looked at him. "Your equipment isn't wrong, Gunnery Sergeant. You're reading the wrong wind." That sentence landed in the middle of the group like something thrown from a great height. Carter looked at her for a long moment. The men around him were very still, the way men get when a conversation has moved into territory that could go in several different directions, and none of them are entirely sure which one it's going to choose. Carter crossed his arms. "You're saying our equipment is reading one wind and the bullets flying through a different one." "I'm saying your equipment is reading one wind at one point and your bullet is flying through multiple winds across a 1,200-meter flight path." "Yes. And you can see those different winds." "I can read them. The environmental signs are there if you know what to look for." Walsh leaned toward Reyes and said not very quietly, "Tell me this isn't happening. Tell me we're not getting a ballistics lesson from the janitor." Emily Parker heard it. She did not react. She kept her eyes on Carter. Carter heard it too. He gave Walsh a look that communicated precisely nothing good about Walsh's immediate future, then turned back to Emily. Something had shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite respect yet. It was more like the particular attention a man gives something when he's realized it might be more than he initially assessed. "Let's say you're right," Carter said. "What's the solution?" "The solution is to read the full environment, not just the close-in measurement. The grass movement, the dust devils, the direction of the heat shimmer at different distances, the behavior of birds in the valley. All of those things are giving you wind data that no instrument can capture, because the instruments only measure where they are. The environment is measuring everywhere." Brooks was listening very carefully now. His head had tilted slightly to one side, the way people move when something is connecting with a pattern they've been trying to solve. "That's essentially what I was trying to describe," he said, "the multi-layer wind environment." Emily looked at him. "You were close. You were missing the thermal component. The valley is losing heat faster on the north-facing slope right now, and that differential is generating a subtle crosswind at altitude that doesn't show up on the surface at all. It's pulling your rounds just before they reach the target." "How do you compensate for something you can't measure?" Brooks asked. "You measure it differently. You learn to read what the environment is showing you instead of relying only on instruments. You watch. You wait. You find the moment when all the layers briefly align and the path clears. Then you shoot. Carter had been listening to this exchange with his arms still crossed and his face in that carefully neutral position that experienced leaders use when they're reassessing something they had already decided about. He was good staying neutral while his mind worked hard in the other direction. "Ms. Parker," he said finally, "are you suggesting that you can identify that moment, the window you're describing?" "Yes." "And you could hit the target?" It was not quite a question. It was not quite a challenge. It was something in between, and Emily Parker recognized exactly what it was. "If you want to see it," she said, "give me one shot." Nobody laughed that time. Walsh looked like he wanted to, but something in the air around the firing line had changed. The mood had shifted in one of those quiet, certain ways that people can feel but struggle to explain. It was the feeling of a moment that was about to become something worth remembering. Carter uncrossed his arms. He looked at Emily Parker for a long time. He looked at the way she was standing, which was not the way a maintenance worker stood. He looked at the steadiness in her eyes, which was not the steadiness of someone who had just gotten lucky with a confident statement. He had spent decades reading people, and what he was reading right now was not what she had told him she was. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he was going to find out. "One shot," Carter said. "One shot," Emily agreed. She walked toward the equipment area with the same unhurried stride she'd had when she was pushing a broom, and the team watched her open a hard-sided case they had all walked past a dozen times without giving it a second glance. It had been sitting beside the maintenance locker at the back of the range control area. Nobody had looked at it because nobody looked at maintenance equipment. It had been there unremarkable and invisible for as long as any of them could remember. The lid came open. Walsh was the first one to see what was inside, and the expression on his face went through several changes in rapid sequence, dismissal, confusion, recalibration, and something that might have been the early stages of alarm. Inside the case was a precision rifle, unlike anything the standard armory issued. It was a custom build, clearly the work of someone with extensive knowledge of long-range precision platforms. The stock was adjusted for a specific shooter's dimensions. The barrel was hand-lapped. The optic was a unit that cost more than most people's cars. The suppressor attached to the muzzle was military specification, the kind that required a very specific set of permissions to possess. This was not a hunting rifle. This was not a hobby gun. This was a precision instrument built for one specific purpose, and it had been maintained with the obsessive care of someone who understood exactly what that purpose was. Carter stared at it. Then he looked at Emily Parker. Emily was checking the rifle with practiced efficiency, not the careful slow-motion handling of someone who was being cautious with an unfamiliar weapon, but the fast, confident function checks of someone who had performed this specific sequence. So many times it had stopped being a sequence and become a single fluid movement. "Where did," Carter started. "Approved for range use," Emily said without looking up from her function check. "All paperwork is in order." "That's not what I was going to ask." "I know." She looked up briefly. "Let's focus on the shot, Gunnery Sergeant." Something in her tone, not aggressive, not dismissive, but carrying a very precise quality of authority, told Carter that this particular line of questioning was going to take longer to resolve than the 90 minutes of daylight they had remaining. He made a decision that surprised him, which was to let it go for now and watch what happened next. Emily settled behind the rifle. She positioned herself with the natural, economical body mechanics of an experienced shooter. The kind of positioning that wasn't learned in an afternoon but deposited layer by layer over thousands of hours on a trigger. Her support hand found the forend without looking. Her cheek came to the stock. Her shooting eye aligned with the optic in a single smooth motion. Then she stopped. She did not fire. She did not adjust her scope. She did not reach for a measuring device or a calculator. She just watched. Carter checked his watch. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The team exchanged glances. Walsh started to say something and Reyes silenced him with a look. Emily Parker watched the valley the way a hawk watches a field, with a completeness of attention that was almost difficult to observe because most people don't look at anything with that quality of focus, and being near it made something in the observer's chest feel slightly different. She was reading the grass. She was reading the dust. She was reading the heat patterns and the flag positions and the subtle bend in the heat shimmer that indicated where the invisible rivers of air were moving through the space between the muzzle and the target. Brooks found himself holding his breath. Then Emily's right hand settled. Her finger came to the trigger guard. Her breathing changed, slowed, steadied, found a rhythm that seemed connected to something outside her, rather than inside. She waited. The desert was quiet except for the wind, which was doing exactly what she had said it was doing, shifting, layering, contradicting itself in the way that complex terrain always does. She waited. Carter was about to say something when the rifle fired. The suppressor reduced the report to a sharp, contained crack. The bullet left the muzzle at a velocity that made the air shimmer briefly at the crown of the barrel. 1,000 yards downrange, it was invisible. 1,300 yards still invisible. 1,500 yards gone completely from any realistic tracking. 1,700 yards away, the steel target rang like a bell being struck by a hammer. The sound traveled back across the valley and arrived at the firing line about 2 full seconds after the shot. It was a clean, unmistakable, metallic clang that every shooter present had heard before and knew instantly for what it was. A hit. Nobody spoke. Brooks looked through his spotting scope. The target was still swinging gently on its mount. Dead center. The round had struck within 2 inches of the plate's geometric center. Hit, Reyes said quietly. His voice carried the tone of a man who was revising several things at once. Walsh said nothing. For perhaps the first time in anyone's memory, Walsh had nothing to say. Carter stood very still behind Emily Parker's position. He was looking at the target through his own optic. He was looking at the evidence of something he had just witnessed and could not immediately categorize in any of the frameworks he used to understand the world. Emily Parker was already standing up. She went through her post-shot routine with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown throughout clearing the weapon, returning it to its case, closing the latches. The window was approximately 6 seconds, she said in the tone of someone offering a technical debrief. The surface wind and the upper channel aligned for that period, which opened a corridor through the layered air masses. Inside that window, the trajectory is clean. Outside it, you get what you've been getting all day. Carter turned to look at her. He had been going to say something about the shot. He had 100 different thoughts arranged behind his teeth. He had questions about the rifle, about her background, about what exactly a maintenance contractor needed with a precision instrument worth more than his truck, and why she moved and spoke and shot like someone who had spent her career doing precisely this. But before any of that came out, he noticed something. When Emily had lifted the rifle to clear it for storage, the sleeve of her maintenance uniform had ridden up slightly at the forearm. And on the inside of the case lid, where most people put nothing, there was a laminated card, small, partially obscured by the rifle's cleaning kit, the kind of card that looked administrative and unremarkable, except for the seal in the upper left corner. Carter leaned forward slightly. He could not read the text from where he was standing, but he could read the seal. He had seen that seal before, not often, but in certain specific contexts, in certain specific environments and conversations that did not go in official reports. He straightened up. He looked at Emily Parker with completely different eyes than the ones he'd been using a minute ago. "Ms. Parker," he said carefully, "Gunnery Carter, the rifle, the card on the case lid, the way you just held that weapon." He paused. "Who are you?" Emily Parker closed the latches on the case and looked at him with an expression that was for the first time something other than completely neutral. There was something in it that was almost warm, something that might have been the edge of an explanation she had been waiting a long time to give. "I told you," she said. "Emily Parker, government contractor." She picked up the equipment case. She picked up a push broom she had set against the wall. "Same as always," she said, and she walked back toward the maintenance locker unhurried, as if none of what had just happened was anything other than an ordinary afternoon. The Marine stood at the firing line in the cooling Mojave air, surrounded by 237 failed rounds and one steel plate still swinging gently in the mountain wind. And not one of them, not the gunnery sergeant who had spent decades reading people, not the sergeant who had almost understood the problem, not the corporal who had laughed, had even a single adequate word for what they were feeling. The broom began to sweep. The target kept swinging. And the woman who had just done the impossible went back to looking like nobody at all. Carter stood at the firing line for a long time after Emily Parker walked away. He stood there the way a man stands when the ground beneath him has shifted and he hasn't decided yet whether to acknowledge it. The desert wind moved across the range. The steel target at 1,700 yards had stopped swinging. The evidence of what had just happened was fading into the ordinary background of the afternoon, the way extraordinary things sometimes do when they're surrounded by enough silence. Then Carter turned to his team. "Nobody talks about what just happened," he said. "Not to each other, not to anyone on base." "Am I clear?" The men nodded. Walsh opened his mouth and Carter looked at him and Walsh closed it again. "Back to the firing line," Carter said. "We're not done here." But even as he said it, even as the team moved back into their positions and began the mechanical rituals of resetting, for another attempt, Carter's eyes kept moving. Back to the maintenance locker. Back to the hard-sided case sitting on the equipment shelf. Back to the woman in the gray uniform who was now on the far side of the range, 60 yards away, running a cleaning rod through the bracket that held a range marker flag. She wasn't looking at them. She never looked at them. And that, Carter realized, was itself a kind of information. Brooks settled behind his rifle again. Reyes picked up his spotting scope. The team went through their wind calls, their scope adjustments, their calculations. They tried to apply what Emily had said about layered air currents in thermal differentials. They tried to read the grass and the dust in the shimmer of heat across the valley floor. On the first shot after the demonstration, Brooks hit the target. The team erupted, not loudly. These were Marine snipers, not a football crowd, but there was an unmistakable shift of energy, a release of something that had been building under pressure for 3 hours. Reyes grabbed Brooks by the shoulder. Even Walsh let out a breath that carried the shape of a laugh inside it. Carter said nothing. He was watching Emily Parker. She had not reacted, had not looked up, had not given any indication that she knew the shot had connected. She simply kept working methodically the way she always worked, as if the firing range around her were a separate country she had no particular interest in visiting. That was not normal behavior for a civilian on an active training range. When something significant happened around them, civilians looked. It was instinct. It was human nature. The absence of that reaction was its own kind of data. Carter made a decision. He walked away from the firing line, away from his team, and moved toward the far end of the range where Emily was working. He kept his stride casual because he was aware that whatever this situation was, confronting it directly and loudly in front of his team was probably not the right approach. He got within 10 feet of her before she spoke without looking up. "The team is going to need to keep applying the layered wind method consistently," she said. "The thermal channel is going to shift again in about 20 minutes as the sun drops further. They'll need to recalibrate." Carter stopped. "How did you know I was coming over here?" "I heard your footsteps change direction. I was 60 yards away." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. She continued working on the flag bracket with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. Up close, he could see things he hadn't noticed before. The maintenance uniform was clean and pressed with a precision that maintenance uniforms generally were not. Her hands, which were currently engaged with a routine cleaning task, moved with the economy of motion of someone who had trained extensively with those hands. And her eyes, when she finally looked up at him, were the eyes of someone who was always reading the room, even when they appeared not to be. "Emily Parker," Carter said. Yes. "Government contractor?" "Yes." "Maintenance division?" "That's what my badge says." Carter tilted his head slightly. "How long have you been on this base?" A brief pause. Not a nervous pause. A measured one. "A while." "How long is a while?" "Long enough to know that your team has been struggling with this range for about 3 weeks," she said. "Not just today. The desert wind patterns here are complex and they change seasonally. Most teams rotate through before they figure it out. Your team has been here longer than most." Carter absorbed this. She had been watching them for 3 weeks. Not just today. 3 weeks of watching and saying nothing, moving around the base in a gray uniform, doing what maintenance workers did, being invisible. "Why didn't you say anything before today?" he asked. Emily Parker set down her cleaning rod and looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. "Because you weren't ready to hear it before today," she said simply. It was not an insult. It was a statement delivered with the calm clarity of someone who had assessed a situation over time and reached a conclusion, which made it somehow worse than an insult because Carter couldn't argue with it, and he knew it. He stood there for a moment with that truth sitting between them. Then he said, "The rifle in your case, that's not standard contractor equipment." "No." "The serial number on that optic?" "I've seen that configuration before. Not on civilian equipment. Emily Parker did not answer immediately. She picked up her cleaning rod again. Your team has about 18 minutes before the thermal shift, she said. If they don't recalibrate before then, they'll lose the window. Carter stared at her. He was a man who understood when a door was being closed in his face. He also understood that pressing a closed door sometimes produced results and sometimes produced consequences, and he didn't yet know which category this was. He turned and walked back to the firing line. But he kept thinking. He kept turning over every small piece of what he'd observed. The rifle, the card on the case lid with the government seal, the way she moved and spoke and shot, the 3 weeks of silent observation, the way she had known the exact moment to speak and the exact thing to say to produce maximum effect. None of it added up to a maintenance contractor. All of it added up to something else entirely. Something Carter had encountered only a few times in his career, in specific contexts, in specific environments, around specific operations that didn't get discussed in open company. He wasn't ready to name it yet, but the shape of it was forming in his mind like a photograph developing in a darkroom. He reached the firing line as Brooks was recalibrating his scope. "Listen to me," Carter said quietly, and something in his tone brought every man's attention to him immediately. "What she told you about the layered wind, apply it exactly. Don't approximate. Don't compromise. Do exactly what she described and see what happens. We've got about 18 minutes before the conditions shift again." Brooks looked at him with a question in his eyes, but didn't ask it. He turned back to his rifle. The next 17 minutes on that firing line were among the most concentrated pieces of work Carter had watched his team produce. They applied Emily's method with the kind of focused discipline that only comes when men realize they've been given a tool that actually works. They watched the natural environment they're in. They read the grass and the dust and the shimmer. They called wind in layers instead of as a single number. They waited for the alignment instead of firing on schedule. In 17 minutes, the team produced 11 hits on a target they hadn't been able to hit once in 3 hours. 11 hits. When the 18th minute arrived and the thermal shift changed the wind dynamics exactly as Emily had predicted, Carter held up a fist and the team stopped firing. In the sudden quiet he heard from 60 yards away, the sound of a push broom moving across concrete. He turned. Emily Parker was sweeping the equipment bay with the same unhurried rhythm as always. He watched her for a long moment. Then he walked back to the command post, picked up his radio, and made a call that was not to the range safety officer, and was not to his battalion commander, and was not to anyone on the base operations staff. The call lasted 45 seconds. He spoke quietly. The person on the other end spoke even more quietly. Then Carter ended the call and set the radio down and stood very still for about 10 seconds. His expression when he turned back toward the range was not the expression of a man who had just confirmed what he already suspected. It was the expression of a man who had just been told something considerably more significant than that. He looked at Emily Parker from across the range. She was still sweeping. I thought about the conversation he'd just had. He thought about the words the voice on the other end of that call had used. Words like classified and ongoing and need to know and assets in place. Words that individually meant specific things and together meant something that required a certain kind of mental adjustment before you could fully absorb it. He walked toward her again. This time he didn't try to be casual about it. She heard him coming and stopped sweeping and turned to face him before he reached her. She read something in his stride because Emily Parker read everything, and what she read told her that the conversation had changed categories. Carter stopped 4 feet away. He looked at her carefully. "I made a call," he said. "I know. They told me your access level." "They told you some of it," she said. Carter blinked. He had not expected that. The information he'd been given had seemed complete. The access level he'd been quoted was already higher than most people in his chain of command would ever reach. The idea that there was more above it required a brief moment of reorientation. "How long?" he asked. 14 months, Emily said, "on this installation." 14 months. Carter did the math quickly. 14 months of gray uniform and push broom and unremarkable presence. 14 months of watching and listening and being seen by hundreds of people every day and noticed by none of them. "What are you assessing?" he asked. "I'm not authorized to tell you that." "Does it involve my team?" "I'm not authorized to tell you that either." Carter looked at her for a moment with an expression that was trying to find its footing between professional respect and something considerably more uncomfortable. The shot today, he said, that wasn't necessary for whatever you're doing here. You chose to do that. Emily Parker was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, something in her voice was slightly different from the measured precision it usually carried. Your team is deploying in 11 days, she said. Where they're going, what they'll face, the conditions are going to be significantly more challenging than this range. They needed to understand layered wind environments before they left. They were not going to get there on their own in the time remaining. Carter stared at her. You intervened. You broke your cover profile. I made a judgment call. Why, she picked up the broom. She looked at the range where his team was running through another string of successful fire, applying her methods with growing confidence. She watched them for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, but was not, Carter realized, indifferent. Not at all. Because they needed to come home, she said quietly. And she turned and walked back to her work. Carter stood there for a long moment. The desert wind moved across the range. His team was hitting targets they couldn't have hit an hour ago. And the woman who had made that possible was pushing a broom 60 yards away, invisible again, unremarkable again, exactly what she had always appeared to be. He went back to the command post and watched his team train. But something had broken open in the afternoon. Something that couldn't be closed again, and Carter knew it. The shape of Emily Parker had changed in his mind from a strange footnote to a central fact, and now that he was looking at her differently, he was beginning to see all the things that had been there the whole time and that he had simply never bothered to look at. The way she moved through the range always gave her maximum visibility of the firing positions. The way she scheduled her maintenance tasks so that she was never behind a structure or a barrier when active shooting was happening. The way she positioned herself, always with a clear line of sight to both the firing line and the downrange environment. The way her push broom happened to take her across every corner of the range complex over the course of each day, so that over a week, over a month, she had covered every inch of it. None of that was maintenance work. All of it was surveillance. Carter's radio crackled. It was the battalion operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Whitmore, who Carter had a professional relationship with, that was built on mutual efficiency and very little warmth. Carter, heard your team had a breakthrough this afternoon. Yes, sir. Range safety officer says your hit rate in the last 40 minutes was above 90%. That's correct, sir. A pause on the radio. What changed? Carter looked across the range at Emily Parker. We applied some new techniques for reading environmental wind data, he said carefully. Multi-layer approach instead of single-point measurement. Where'd that come from? On-site assessment, Carter said. Which was not a lie. It was simply an answer that answered a different question than the one being asked. Another pause. Whitmore was not a stupid man. All right, he said. Carry on. Evaluation continues at 0700 tomorrow. Copy that, sir. Carter set down the radio. He made a note in his field journal. Then he crossed out the note because some things were better kept only in memory. The afternoon training continued. By the time the light was falling and the range was being shut down for the day, Carter's team had produced the best collective performance numbers of the entire 3-week training block. The scores that had been dragging them toward deployment failure were now not only sufficient, but exceptional. Brooks alone had hit 22 consecutive shots in the last session, applying Emily's environmental reading method with the natural aptitude of a man who had been missing a critical piece of information his entire career and had just received it. Walsh had stopped making jokes. This was itself a remarkable development. Walsh used humor the way some men used armor, constantly reflexively, to deflect anything that came too close to the parts of himself he didn't examine. But Walsh had been quiet for the last 2 hours, shooting carefully, watching the environment, the way Emily had described, and his results showed in the numbers. As the team was breaking down equipment, at the end of the day, Reyes came to Carter with something in his hand. It was a small card, laminated, the kind Carter had glimpsed on the inside lid of Emily's rifle case earlier in the afternoon. Found it on the equipment shelf, Reyes said. I think it fell out of her case when she was loading out. Carter took it. He looked at it. The seal in the upper left corner was the one he had already identified. Below it was a name. Below the name was a designation that required a specific clearance level to understand the full meaning of. But Carter had that clearance level and he understood it completely. He read it twice. Then he looked up at the maintenance locker on the far side of the range. The door was closed. The lock was engaged. The gray uniform was hanging on a hook inside, though Carter couldn't see that. What he could see was that the hard-sided rifle case was gone. Emily Parker was gone. He hadn't seen her leave. He hadn't heard her leave. She had simply ceased to be present in the space where she had been present, as completely and as quietly as a change in the wind, and nobody had noticed. Carter looked at the card in his hand again. The name was the same, Emily Parker, but the designation beneath it, the agency designation, the operational classification, the clearance tier. Those were not the details of a government contractor who maintained range equipment. Those were the details of a special agent of a federal intelligence organization whose specific operational division was responsible for, among other things, the assessment of military readiness, the identification of security vulnerabilities in domestic installations, and the long-term undercover evaluation of personnel in sensitive positions. She had not been maintaining the range. She had been evaluating everything on it, including them. Carter put the card in his front pocket. He buttoned the pocket. He stood for a moment in the cooling desert air and considered the implications of 14 months of invisible observation. He thought about every training session that had occurred on this range during that period, every conversation at the command post, every decision he had made in view of a maintenance worker he had never once considered significant. I thought about all the things an intelligent, trained, highly experienced intelligence operative could learn about a Marine sniper team over 14 months of unrestricted observation. He thought about the shot, one shot, 1,700 yards, dead center, not to prove something, not to show off. But because 11 days before a deployment into a dangerous environment, a team of men who needed to understand something had not yet understood it, and she had made a judgment call. Because she wanted them to come home. Carter walked to his vehicle. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for a while. Through the windshield, he could see the range complex settling into the quiet of early evening. The targets downrange were just shapes in the dimming light. The firing positions were empty. The command post was dark. He pulled out the card and looked at it one more time. Then he pulled out his phone and called a number he had only used twice before in his career. The phone rang once, a voice answered. Carter identified himself using a code that he had memorized years ago and never expected to use in this context. He said, "I need to know the status of an asset. Designation follows." He read the designation from the card. The silence on the other end of the call lasted 6 seconds. Then the voice said something that Carter absorbed without expression, though what it said rewrote nearly everything he thought he understood about the last 6 weeks and the preceding 14 months in the evaluation that was happening around his team. He ended the call. He sat with what he now knew for a while longer. Then he started the engine and drove off the range past the maintenance building, past the equipment locker with the gray uniform, inside past the place where a woman had swept floors and changed brackets and applied cleaning rods to flag mounts and watched everything and been seen by no one. He drove back toward the barracks where his team was already talking about the afternoon, already celebrating the breakthrough, already rebuilding the confidence that 3 weeks of failure had eroded. He would tell them something tomorrow. Not everything, not yet, but something, because they were deploying in 11 days. And the woman who had just spent 14 months making sure she understood them better than they understood themselves had made a judgment call and showed them something they needed to know. The least Carter could do was make sure they understood why. His team had spent 3 hours failing at a target that was entirely within their capability. They had spent the last 40 minutes succeeding because someone who had every reason to stay invisible had chosen not to be. That was the part that stayed with Carter all the way back to base. Not the shot, not the revelation about who Emily Parker actually was, not even the classified information the phone call had delivered. What stayed with him was the reason she had given. 3 words, quiet, simple, carrying the full weight of everything that uniform was supposed to mean. Because they needed to come home. Carter drove through the base gate, nodded to the sentry, and kept his face neutral until he was past the checkpoint and alone again on the road between the gate and the barracks. Then he allowed himself briefly to feel what the afternoon had actually cost him. Not in pride, not in certainty about his own abilities, though those things were involved, but something more fundamental, the recognition that the best protection his team had received in the entire 3 weeks of preparation for this deployment had come from a source none of them had ever looked at directly. And the question now, the one that would not leave him alone, that would ride with him through dinner and through the briefing and through the quiet hours before sleep, was simple. What else had he been looking at without seeing? The answer to that question was going to determine everything about what happened next. And somewhere off this base in a location Carter did not know and could not access Emily Parker, Special Agent Emily Parker, with her classified designation and her custom rifle, and her 14 months of invisible work, it was already moving on to whatever came after. She had given them the tool. The question now was whether they were ready to use it. 11 days, the clock was already running. The card stayed in Carter's front pocket all night. He didn't sleep, not really. He lay on his bunk in the dark and stared at the ceiling and turned over everything he knew, everything he suspected, and everything the phone call had told him. And by the time the base came alive at 0500, he had arrived at a decision that he hadn't entirely planned, but that felt in the way certain decisions feel completely inevitable. I was going to find her, not to confront, not to report, not to demand answers he didn't have clearance to receive. He was going to find Emily Parker, because 11 days before his team deployed into an environment that would test everything they had, the most important conversation he could have was not with his battalion commander or his operations officer or any of the men in his chain of command. It was with the woman who had spent 14 months understanding his team better than he did. 0600. The range complex was not yet open for training. Carter walked through the maintenance yard in the gray early light, past the equipment locker, past the cleaning station toward the administrative building at the north end of the compound where the contractor support staff kept their offices. Small rooms, functional. The kind of spaces that existed because someone needed somewhere to put the paperwork in the supply orders in the scheduling logs that kept a training range operational. He knocked on the third door on the left. Silence. He knocked again. The door opened. Emily Parker was already in her uniform, not the gray maintenance uniform, a different one, civilian professional dark slacks, a plain jacket, the kind of clothing that said administrative without saying anything specific about what kind of administrative. She looked at Carter with an expression that was unsurprised and unlocked her face from whatever it had been doing before he knocked. "Gunnery Sergeant," she said. "You knew I'd come," Carter said. "I thought it was possible. Can I come in?" She stepped back from the door. The office was small, a desk, 2 chairs, a laptop, a filing cabinet. On the desk was a coffee cup and a folder that she closed as Carter entered. Nothing on the walls, nothing personal on any surface. The room had the quality of a space that was being used efficiently and would leave no trace when it was vacated. Carter sat in one of the chairs without being invited. Emily sat behind the desk. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and waited. "The designation on the card," Carter said. "I made a call last night." "I know. They told me you're running a readiness assessment, long-term, multi-unit. They told you what they're authorized to tell you. Is my team part of the assessment?" Emily looked at him for a moment. The morning light coming through the single window made the room feel very still. "Every team that has trained on this range in the last 14 months is part of the assessment," she said carefully. "I'm not evaluating your team specifically. I'm evaluating systemic readiness across multiple units under realistic conditions." Carter absorbed this. "And what have you found systemically?" "I'm not authorized to share assessment conclusions with personnel who are subjects of the assessment. I'm asking as a team leader who deploys in 11 days. "I know what you're asking and why." Emily set down her coffee cup. "And I'm going to tell you something that is not in my assessment report and is not part of my official mandate. I'm going to tell you because it's true and because you need to hear it." Carter straightened slightly. "Your team is good," Emily said. "Technically proficient, physically capable, well-led, but they've been trained to trust systems over instinct, instruments over observation, technology over judgment. And in the environment you're going into, there will be moments, and there will be more than a few of them, where the technology fails, the instruments give bad data, and the only thing standing between your people and a catastrophic decision is raw human judgment applied to real environmental information." She paused. "That's what yesterday was about." Carter looked at her carefully. "You broke cover to give them a lesson. I made a judgment call. A judgment call that compromised a 14-month operation." Emily Parker met his eyes without flinching. "A judgment call that might keep 12 men alive," she said. "I'll take that trade." The silence in the room had weight. Carter felt it pressing on the conversation on both of them. He looked at this woman, This person who had been invisible on his range for over a year, who had watched him fail and succeed and lead and occasionally lose his temper, who had observed more about his team than any official evaluation process ever captured, and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Gratitude, plain and uncomfortable and real. "Thank you," he said. Emily blinked. Just once. It was Carter realized the first time he had seen anything on her face that resembled being caught off guard. "You're welcome," she said quietly. Carter stood up. "One more question." "You can ask." "The shot yesterday, 1,700 yards, wind conditions that my entire team couldn't compensate for." He paused. "How long did it take you to be able to do that?" Emily Parker looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face, not sadness exactly, but the relative of sadness that lives in the neighborhood of sacrifice and long years, and the particular cost of becoming very good at something that most people will never know you can do. "Longer than you'd want to know," she said. Carter nodded. He walked to the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "The evaluation tomorrow. 0700. My team will be ready." "I know they will," Emily said. Carter left. The door closed behind him. And Emily Parker sat alone in her small office with her coffee going cold and her clothes folder on the desk, and for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment that no assessment report would ever capture, she allowed herself to feel the weight of 14 months of invisibility and the strange, particular satisfaction of having done something that mattered in a way that no one would officially acknowledge. Then she opened the folder and went back to work. 0700. The range was alive with a different energy than it had carried the day before. The team assembled at the firing line with the focused quiet of men who had spent the previous evening consolidating something new into their understanding of their own craft. Brooks was the first one positioned. Reyes was beside him. Walsh arrived without a joke, which was becoming his new signature. Carter stood at the command post and watched them set up. What he did not expect was the vehicle that pulled into the range access road at 0715. It was a dark SUV with government plates, and it parked at the edge of the range complex with the particular confidence of a vehicle whose occupants knew they had the authority to park wherever they chose. Two people got out, both in civilian clothes, both moving with a quality of purposeful efficiency that Carter recognized immediately. They were not base personnel. Carter walked toward them. The taller of the two, a man in his mid-50s with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of decisions made in difficult conditions, held up an identification wallet. Carter looked at it, then he looked at the man. "Colonel Hartman," the man said, though the ID said no such rank. It said something else, something that outranked the word colonel in the way that mattered in certain rooms. "We need to speak with you about yesterday's incident." "Incident," Carter repeated. "The demonstration, the contractor." Hartman glanced toward the range. "Is she still on site?" Carter thought about the closed door in the small office and the cold coffee. "She was this morning," he said. Hartman and his partner exchanged a look. Then Hartman looked back at Carter with an expression that was professionally neutral, but contained around its edges something that Carter read as urgency. "We need to speak with Agent Parker immediately," Hartman said. "There's been a development in her operational situation." Carter felt something cold move through his chest, not fear exactly. The cousin of fear that arrives when you understand that a situation is larger than you were told it was. "What kind of development?" "The kind that isn't discussed in open air," Hartman said. He looked at the firing range team setting up for their evaluation. "Carry on with your assessment. We'll handle our business quietly." Carter watched them walk toward the maintenance complex. He turned back to his team. He told himself to focus. He told himself that whatever was happening in that maintenance building was not his concern and not his clearance and not his problem to solve. He believed himself for about 4 minutes. Then Brooks called from the firing line. "Gunny, you need to see this." Carter walked to the firing position. Brooks was looking through his scope, not at the target, but at the range entrance. Carter followed his sightline. A second vehicle had arrived, then a third, both government plates, both dark, both carrying the particular atmosphere of urgency that Carter associated with things going sideways in ways that hadn't been planned for. "What's going on?" Walsh asked from behind his rifle. "Eyes down range," Carter said automatically. Then more quietly to himself, "I have no idea." He walked toward the maintenance building. He was stopped before he reached the door by Hartman's partner. A woman who hadn't introduced herself and whose expression communicated very clearly that the stopping was not a suggestion. "Sir," she said, "this area is temporarily restricted." "This is my range," Carter said. "Temporarily restricted," she said again with the patient firmness of someone who had said those two words many times in many situations. Carter looked at the door. Through it he could hear voices, not loud, not angry, but carrying the cadence of a conversation that was moving fast and covering complex ground. He could hear Emily Parker's voice level and clear, and Hartman's voice lower and more urgent. He couldn't make out words. He stood outside that door for 45 seconds. That felt considerably longer. And then it ended. Emily Parker came out first. She had changed in some way that Carter couldn't immediately identify. The professional civilian clothes were the same. The face was the same, but something in her bearing had shifted a quality of alertness that had been present before, but was now fully deployed like a weapon that had been carried all day and was finally in hand. She saw Carter. She stopped. Hartman came out behind her and looked at Carter with an expression that said, "This is more complicated than it was supposed to be." "Gunnery Sergeant Carter," Emily said. Her voice was steady, completely steady. "I owe you a conversation." "You don't owe me anything," Carter said. "I'm going to have it anyway." She turned to Hartman. "Give me 10 minutes. Hartman looked at his watch. He looked at the vehicles in the parking area. He looked at Emily with an expression that was trying to decide between operational protocol and personal respect and landing reluctantly on the side of the latter. 10 minutes, he said. Emily walked past Carter toward the firing line. Carter followed. She stopped at a point where they were close enough to the team to be visible, but far enough from the government vehicles and their occupants to have a private conversation. She looked out at the range. Carter stood beside her. "My cover is being pulled," she said. Carter said nothing. "The assessment has been compromised, not by yesterday, by something else, something that was developing before yesterday. Yesterday actually accelerated a decision that was already being made." She paused. "I'm being repositioned. Where I'm not going to tell you that." Carter absorbed this. "The assessment results, your 14 months of work. What happens to that? It goes where all assessment work goes, up the chain, into reports that influence policy, that influences training programs that eventually affect how units like yours are prepared for deployment." She paused. "It does its work invisibly, same as always." Carter looked at her. "Is that enough for you?" The question surprised her. He could see it in the slight shift of her posture. "It has to be," she said. "That's not what I asked." A long pause. The desert wind moved through the range. From behind them, Brooks was calling wind adjustments to Reyes, and the ordinary professional sounds of a sniper team at work provided a strange counterpoint to the conversation happening at the edge of the firing line. "No," Emily said quietly. "It's not always enough, but it's what the work is. You do the thing that needs doing. You do it as well as you can. You don't get to choose whether anyone knows." Carter nodded slowly. "My team, the deployment. Is there anything else you can tell me about what we're going to face?" Emily Parker looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "The environment you're going to is mountainous, high altitude, complex terrain with unpredictable multi-layer wind systems that make what you experienced yesterday look straightforward." She held his gaze. "Everything I taught you applies there, every part of it. The natural indicators, the layered reading, the patience, especially the patience. The tendency to rush in unfamiliar environments is the thing that gets people killed." "I understand. Make sure your team understands, not just as technique, as instinct. By the time you land, it needs to be the way they think, not just something they know." "I'll make sure." Something passed between them in the silence that followed. Not sentiment exactly, something harder and cleaner than sentiment. The recognition between two professionals of something that didn't need to be made into words because the words would only reduce it. "Gunny Carter," Emily said. "Agent Parker." She almost smiled. It was close enough. "Bring them home," she said. She turned and walked back toward Hartman and the waiting vehicles. Carter stood at the edge of the firing line and watched her go. She moved the same way she always moved, unhurried, economical, completely self-contained. She did not look back. She got into the second vehicle. The door closed. The vehicles moved toward the base access road. Within 45 seconds of her departure, the range looked exactly as it had before she arrived. The maintenance locker was there. The equipment bay was there. The push broom was leaning against the wall where she had left it, as if she had never been there at all. Brooks appeared at Carter's shoulder. "Gunny, what just happened?" "Administrative matter," Carter said. "Those vehicles." "Administrative matter, Sergeant." Brooks looked at him for a moment. Then, because Brooks was a very good Marine and a very perceptive man, he let it go. "Range is ready," he said. "Team set. We're good to go whenever you want to start the evaluation." Carter pulled his attention back to the firing line, to the targets, to the 11 days ahead and the work that needed to happen inside them. He pulled his attention back to what was in front of him, because that was the skill that separated the men who survived from the men who didn't. The ability to be completely present for the thing that was actually happening, regardless of what else was pulling at the edges of your focus. "Let's go," Carter said. The evaluation began at 07:53, 53 minutes later than scheduled, and what happened during the next 4 hours was something that the range safety officer would later describe in his written report as the most significant single-session performance improvement he had observed in over a decade of running evaluation programs. The team hit everything, not most things, not the majority of targets, everything. Brooks ran a string of 31 consecutive hits, including 3 at ranges that exceeded the evaluation's required parameters and were therefore marked as bonus achievements in the scoring system. Walsh, who had been the team's most reliable shooter on close and medium ranges, but had always struggled at extreme distances, produced his longest successful string ever, 24 hits at ranges between 1,200 and 1,600 yards, using the environmental reading method Emily had demonstrated. Reyes, watching through his spotting scope, was calling winds with a vocabulary of natural indicators that he hadn't possessed the previous morning. He talked about grass angles and dust behavior and heat shimmer direction as fluently as he had previously talked about kestrel readings and ballistic calculator outputs. He was reading the same environment with different eyes, and the difference in what he could see was the difference between guessing and knowing. Carter watched all of it from the command post. He watched his team work, and he thought about Emily Parker in that SUV moving away down the access road. And he thought about 14 months of invisible presence and one visible moment that had changed the trajectory of 12 men who would never fully understand why. At 1100 hours, the range safety officer walked to Carter's position with a clipboard and a look on his face that sat somewhere between professional and impressed. "Gunny Carter," he said, "I have to ask, what changed?" "We addressed a training gap," Carter said. "What gap?" "Environmental reading, multi-layer wind assessment, natural indicators as supplementary data sources." The range safety officer wrote something on his clipboard. "Who provided the supplementary training?" Carter looked at him. He thought about the gray uniform in the maintenance locker. He thought about the push broom leaning against the wall. He thought about a card in his front pocket with a government seal that meant things he wasn't going to put in a report today. "On-site consultation," Carter said. The range safety officer nodded slowly. The way people nod when they're aware they're not getting the full picture, but have decided that the full picture is not what they're there to collect. "All right," he said. "Based on today's results, your team qualifies for deployment. Scores are above threshold across all evaluation categories." Carter received this information with a steadiness that came from having wanted it for 3 weeks and having arrived at it through a path he hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully explain. "Thank you," he said. The range safety officer left. Carter stood at the command post alone for a moment. Then he walked to the firing line, where his team was breaking down equipment, and he stood in front of them all. 12 of them, and he looked at each face in turn with the particular attention of a man who is memorizing something. "Listen to me," he said. "The equipment work stopped. What happened yesterday and today, what changed, that's not going to be explained in any official document. What I'm going to tell you is the only version of this that you're going to hear from me, and it's the version that matters." He paused. "You were trained by one of the best in the world. You don't know her name. You don't know her background. You know one thing, she knew something you didn't, and she chose to show you, and you were good enough to learn it. That's it. Hold on to what you learned. Take it with you. Use it." Walsh, for the first time in anyone's memory, was completely and absolutely serious. "Gunny," he said. "Who was she?" Carter looked at him. He thought about the answer to that question, about all the layers of it, about everything the question contained, and everything the full answer would require. "Someone who wanted you to come home," Carter said. Nobody said anything after that. The team finished breaking down their equipment in silence, and the silence was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that comes when something has been said that is exactly right, and any addition to it would only make it less. Carter picked up the push broom from where Emily had left it against the maintenance wall. He carried it to the equipment bay and hung it on its hook. He stood there for a moment in the quiet of the empty bay, looking at the ordinary tools of an ordinary job that had been used for 14 months as cover for something extraordinary. Then he closed the bay door and walked back to his team. 9 days of preparation remained. 9 days to take everything they had learned and make it as permanent and reliable as breathing. 9 days to transform technique into instinct, and instinct into the kind of deep knowledge that holds under pressure, under fire, under the specific conditions of an environment they hadn't been to yet, but that Emily Parker had somehow already accounted for. 9 days. Carter looked at the range one more time before he left. The targets downrange were still. The valley beyond was quiet. The desert air moved across everything with the same invisible complexity. It had always had layers and channels and thermal differentials, and the 1,000 small stories written in grass movement and dust behavior that most people spent their entire lives never learning to read. The range looked exactly the same as it had looked yesterday morning before any of this happened. But the 12 men preparing to leave it were not the same, and the mountains they were going to in 9 days would meet different men than would have arrived without a woman in a gray uniform who swept floors and changed flag brackets and waited patiently for the exact moment when what she knew could save the lives of men who hadn't known they needed saving. Carter got in his vehicle. He did not look back at the empty maintenance bay, but he put his hand on his front pocket where the card was and held it there for a moment. Then he drove toward the barracks, toward his team, toward the work that remained. The range fell silent behind him. The wind kept moving, and the invisible lessons of a woman who was already gone continued to work their way into the hands and eyes and instincts of 12 Marines who would carry them to the other side of the world. Part 4, the truth behind the disguise. 9 days moved the way time moves before a deployment, simultaneously too fast and too slow, compressed in some hours and stretched almost unbearably. In others, the minutes before sleep, always the longest, and the mornings always arriving before the mind was ready for them. Carter ran his team hard through every one of those 9 days, not punishingly, not the way he had driven them in the weeks before when frustration had been sharpening itself into something that looked like discipline, but was actually closer to desperation. He ran them with purpose now, with direction. There was a difference, and every man on the team felt it, though none of them would have been able to describe it precisely if asked. What had changed was that Carter knew what he was building toward. The morning sessions were environmental reading drills. Carter took them off the range and put them in the terrain, around the base, in the scrubland, in the shallow valleys, in the rocky rises that approximated, in a modest California way, the kind of complex topography they would encounter overseas. He made them read wind without instruments. He made them describe what the grass told them and what the dust told them and what the angle of the heat shimmer at different distances told them. He made them argue about what they were seeing because disagreement was where real understanding lived, and the men who could defend their environmental right under pressure were the men whose environmental reads would hold when it mattered. Walsh was the biggest surprise. In the field exercises away from the rifle and the formal structure of the firing line, Walsh's natural gifts revealed themselves in ways that years of conventional training had never surfaced. He had extraordinary peripheral awareness, the ability to register movement and change across a wide field of view simultaneously, which was not a taught skill but an innate one that could be developed but not installed from scratch. In the previous weeks, that awareness had nowhere to go inside the framework of instrument-dependent marksmanship. Now it had a home. Walsh was reading environments faster than anyone else on the team and reading them more accurately, and the transformation in his performance numbers was steep enough that Carter had to recalibrate his understanding of who his best assets actually were. Gunny, Walsh said on the 5th morning during a break in the field exercise. He said it without the usual edge of performance, without the humor armor, just quietly, directly. I've been thinking about the maintenance lady. Carter looked at him. I was a jerk to her, Walsh said, in front of everyone, when she first said something at the range. He paused. I want you to know I know that. Carter studied Walsh for a moment. Why are you telling me? Because I think she could hear me, and she didn't react. And I've been thinking about what kind of person doesn't react when someone's being a jerk to them in front of a crowd. He paused again. The kind of person who's already decided it doesn't matter what people like me think, because they know something about themselves that makes the opinion of a corporal from Louisiana irrelevant. He looked at Carter. That's a different kind of strength than anything I've trained for. Carter said nothing for a moment. Then keep that thought. Take it with you. Yes, Gunny. Walsh went back to the exercise. Carter watched him go and thought, not for the first time, that the most significant thing Emily Parker had done on that range had nothing to do with the shot. On the seventh day, Carter received a communication through a channel he hadn't used before, a secure message that arrived on a device he carried but rarely needed delivered without a sender identification that he could immediately trace. The message was 4 sentences long. It said the team's qualification scores have been reviewed at the assessment level. Results have been incorporated into the current readiness report. The environmental awareness component has been flagged for program-wide implementation consideration. Good luck downrange. No name, no designation, no seal, but Carter knew who had sent it. He read it twice, then he secured the device and continued preparing his team for departure. Deployment day arrived on a Tuesday morning at 0400, cold and dark, the kind of darkness that is specific to early morning in the desert when the stars are still out and the world has not yet committed to the day. The team assembled at the staging area with their gear. 12 men, rifles, equipment cases, the organized weight of everything they would carry to the other side of the world. They loaded in silence the way experienced people prepare for serious thing, not quietly because they were afraid, but quietly because the weight of what lay ahead required a certain quality of attention that conversation interrupted. Carter did a final gear check. He walked the line. He looked at each man. He paused at Brooks, who had been quiet all morning, with the inward-focused expression of someone running calculations. You good? Carter asked. Good, Gunny. You're ready for this. I know, Brooks said, and the way he said it, not with bravado, not with the performed confidence of a man trying to convince himself, but with the flat certainty of someone who had done the work and knew what the work had produced, was the most reassuring thing Carter had heard in weeks. He moved to Walsh. How are you, Corporal? Walsh looked at him. In the pre-dawn darkness, without the audience, and the performance pressure that daylight seemed to activate in him, Walsh was a different version of himself. Quieter, more present. Ready, Gunny, he said. I've been watching the wind. Carter almost smiled. Good man. He stepped back and looked at all of them together. 12 men in the dark, carrying everything they needed and everything they had learned, standing at the edge of something that would test all of it. I didn't make a speech. Carter was not a speech-making man. He said what needed to be said and nothing else. Remember what you learned, he said, not just the technique, the thinking behind it. Trust what you observe. Trust the environment. Trust each other. He paused. Let's go. They went. The flight was long, multiple legs. The particular exhausting non-time of military transport where hours pass without landmarks, and the body loses track of day and night, and the mind oscillates between sharp alertness and the gray fog of disrupted sleep. Carter dozed at intervals and woke with the card in his pocket pressing against his ribs, and the 4 sentences of the secure message running through his thoughts on a loop. They landed in a mountain environment very different from the Mojave in the ways that mattered most. The altitude was higher. The temperature swings between day and night were more extreme. The terrain was complex in ways that satellite imagery had suggested, but that physical presence confirmed more dramatically narrow valleys, variable ridgeline elevations, the kind of topography that did exactly what Emily had described. It created layered wind environments of significant complexity where the air moved in multiple directions at multiple altitudes simultaneously, and a single-point measurement was not just incomplete, but actively misleading. Carter watched his team arrive at this environment and watched them look at it. He watched their eyes move across the terrain with the new vocabulary Emily had given them. He watched Brooks tilt his head slightly and track the movement of scrub vegetation at different distances. He watched Walsh look at the dust patterns on the flat ground between 2 ridges with the particular focused attention of a man reading a language he had recently learned and was testing for the first time outside the classroom. Layered, Walsh said quietly to no one in particular. 3 channels, maybe 4. The valley floor is doing its own thing, independent of the ridge draw. Minimum 4, Reyes agreed, looking through his scope at the middle distance. Carter listened to this exchange and said nothing. He was thinking about Emily Parker in her small office with her cold coffee and her clothes folder, and he was thinking about 14 months of invisible work, and he was thinking about the moment she had said, because they needed to come home. The first week in theater was orientation and familiarization. The team mapped their operational environment, established their positions, ran communication checks, built the situational awareness that turned a foreign landscape into a workable operational space. Carter kept driving the environmental reading practice into every part of the day. Before meals, during movement, at every pause in any activity. He made it habitual the way breathing was habitual, so that the men stopped thinking of it as a technique they were applying and started experiencing it as the natural mode of perception they carried everywhere. It was on the 9th day in theater that the situation changed. The team had been assigned to an observation post that covered a specific valley approach, supporting a larger operation that Carter's level of information didn't fully detail. Their job was clear, watch, document, and if necessary, engage. Standard scout sniper work in complex terrain. What was not standard was what happened at 1400 hours on that 9th day. Brooks was on the scope, Reyes was spotting. The rest of the team was in their assigned positions when Brooks spoke in the quiet, controlled tone of a man who has seen something significant and is managing his response to it. Contact, Brooks said. Valley floor, 1,200 meters. Moving element, approximately 8 individuals armed. Carter moved to the observation position. He looked. The element was there, moving with the confident familiarity of people in terrain they knew well, carrying weapons with the casual ease of people who carried them every day. Confirm armed, Reyes said. I've got long weapons on at least 4 of them. What's the wind doing? Carter asked. Surface wind is left to right about 6 miles per hour, Reyes said. But the ridgeline to the north is generating a draw. I'm seeing the vegetation at the 800-meter mark moving opposite the surface wind. Brooks lifted his head from the scope briefly. Same thing as 29 Palms. 2 air masses moving different directions. 3, Walsh said from his position 10 feet away. He was watching the valley with naked eyes. There's a thermal coming off the south face. Heat shimmer at about 400 meters is going straight up, but bending hard right at altitude. That's a 3rd channel. Carter looked at the situation. He looked at the target element, the range, the environmental conditions. He looked at his team, their positioning, their alertness, their collective application of everything they had spent 9 days burning into their operational instincts. Brooks, Carter said quietly, you have got a 3-layer wind environment, call it. Brooks went back to the scope, his breathing steadied. He watched the natural indicators across the valley with the patience that Emily had described, not firing on schedule, but waiting for the alignment for the brief window when the channels briefly harmonized and the path through them cleared. 30 seconds passed, 45, a minute. Walsh's voice was barely audible. Surface and thermal are aligning. The ridge draw is pulling back. I see it, Brooks said. His voice was completely flat, completely focused. I've got the window. Take it, Carter said. The rifle fired at 1,200 meters in a 3-layer wind environment that would have defeated them 3 weeks earlier with certainty. The shot connected with the precision of everything they had learned, compressed into a single moment of execution. The element in the valley scattered. The threat assessment changed instantly. Carter was already on the radio reporting contact, calling in the situation, managing the operational response with the rapid professionalism of a team that had trained for exactly this kind of moment. What followed was 20 minutes of controlled, coordinated action, the kind of work that trained teams do when they have fully internalized their craft and can execute it under real pressure without the hesitation that comes from uncertainty. Certainty, Carter directed. Brooks and Walsh engaged. Reyes spotted and confirmed. The rest of the team maintained security and communication. When it was over, when the situation had resolved and the team was securing their position and waiting for the follow-on element, Reyes sat back from his spotting scope and said something quietly that Carter almost didn't hear over the wind. She knew, Reyes said, the maintenance lady. She knew this was coming. Carter looked at him. She didn't just teach us a shooting technique, Gunny. Reyes looked at him directly. She knew what we were going to face. Specifically, the layered mountain environment, the patience requirement, the natural indicators. She built the lesson around what we were going to need here. He paused. That's not a training gap she filled. That's advanced intelligence applied to training design. Carter held Rajes's gaze for a moment. He thought about the readiness assessment. He thought about the 14 months of observation. He thought about the 4-sentence message on the secure device. He thought about Emily Parker saying, "I'm not authorized to tell you," that with the particular tone of someone who knows exactly what they're not authorized to say. "Document your observation," Carter said carefully. "Keep it in your personal notes." "Not for the official report." "Not yet." Reyes nodded slowly. He understood what Carter was telling him without Carter having told him anything. The follow-on element arrived 40 minutes later. The debrief that followed was thorough and specific. Carter answered every operational question completely and accurately. When the debrief officer asked about the precision of the engagement at 1,200 meters in complex wind conditions, Carter described the methodology his team had used. The debrief officer, a major named Collins, who had a background in special operations and the particular habit of asking questions that sounded administrative but were tracking something specific, leaned forward slightly. "Environmental reading at that granularity," Collins said. "Multi-layer wind assessment using natural indicators. Where did your team develop that capability?" "Pre-deployment training at 29 Palms," Carter said. "Specifically, a supplementary training element that addressed environmental reading gaps in our conventional preparation." Collins wrote something. "Who provided the supplementary element?" Carter looked at him. He thought about the gray uniform. He thought about the push broom. He thought about a card in his front pocket with a seal that meant things he wasn't going to explain in a debrief to a major he'd met 40 minutes ago. "On-site consultation," Carter said. "Contractor support." Collins studied him for a moment with the eyes of a man who knew he was getting a partial answer and was deciding whether to press it. Then he wrote something else and moved on. After the debrief, Carter stepped outside into the mountain air. The altitude made the cold sharper than the desert cold he was used to. The stars were different here, the same stars technically, but seen through different air from different terrain, and so appearing different in the way that all familiar things appear different when you've traveled far enough from where you first knew them. His secure device buzzed. He looked at it. Another message, same channel, no sender identification. 3 sentences this time. "Glad the training was useful. Stay in the Valley Ridge, draw shifts at dusk, creates a 4th channel that closes the window for 40 minutes. Watch the south face thermals." Carter read it twice. He looked at the valley below his position. He looked at the ridge line to the north. He looked at the south face where, as the sun moved toward the horizon, he could already see the heat shimmer beginning to change its behavior. She was watching. From somewhere he couldn't identify through means he couldn't access. Emily Parker was watching a mountain valley halfway around the world and feeding real-time environmental data to a team that had learned 9 days ago in California how to use it. Carter thought about what Reyes had said. That's advanced intelligence applied to training design. I thought about 14 months of invisible assessment. He thought about the 4 sentences before departure and now 3 more sentences in theater. He thought about the particular quality of operational support that didn't announce itself, didn't seek acknowledgement, didn't require any recognition to continue functioning. He thought about the push broom leaning against the wall. He secured the device. He walked back to his team's position. He found Reyes. "New environmental data," Carter said quietly. "Ridge draw shifts at dusk, 4th channel. Closes the window for 40 minutes, starting at approximately 1800 hours. South face thermals will signal the shift watch for the shimmer change." Reyes looked at him. "How do you know?" "Observation," Carter said. Reyes looked at him for a moment longer. Then he nodded and turned back to his spotting scope. The sun continued its descent toward the western ridge. The thermal shimmer on the south face began its subtle change exactly as predicted. At 17:58, Reyes said, "Gunny, south face thermals are shifting." "I see it," Walsh said from his position. "Windows closing." "Stand down on active engagement," Carter said. "Observation only for the next 40 minutes. Then we reassess." The team adjusted. They moved into the patient watchful mode that had become their operational signature reading. Instead of acting, observing, instead of rushing, trusting the environment to tell them when the moment was right. At 1842, the thermal pattern shifted back. The ridge draw resumed its previous behavior. The valley wind settled into the alignment they had learned to recognize. "Windows back," Brooks said. "I concur," Reyes said. "Concur," Walsh said. Carter looked at his team, all of them reading the same environment, all of them arriving at the same conclusion through the same methodology, all of them confident in what they were seeing because they had learned to trust observation over assumption and patience over urgency. 3 weeks ago, they couldn't hit a steel plate at 1,700 yards in the California desert. Tonight, they were running precision environmental analysis at altitude in a combat zone with the fluency of people who had been doing it for years. Carter thought about what that transformation had cost. Not in money, not in official training hours, in the invisible labor of one person who had spent 14 months building an understanding deep enough to know exactly what gap to fill and exactly how to fill it. I thought about Walsh saying that's a different kind of strength than anything I've trained for. He was right. It was. It was the kind of strength that didn't come with rank or recognition or a record of what it had accomplished. It lived in its results, in 12 men on a mountain who could read the wind, in operations that went right because someone had quietly ensured months before anyone knew the need would exist, that the right people had the right knowledge at the right moment. His secure device buzzed again. One sentence, "Good team, Carter." He looked at it for a long moment. Then he typed back 2 words into a channel where he had no confirmation the message would be received, where there was no guarantee the communication went anywhere at all, where the only thing he could be certain of was that he meant what he wrote. "Thank you." He secured the device. He looked at his team in the mountain dark, 12 men, watching a valley with the patient attention of people who had learned to see what most people couldn't. The wind moved through the valley in its complex invisible layers. They read it, every one of them. Carter felt something settle in his chest, something that had been unresolved since the moment a steel target rang in the California desert, and a woman in a gray uniform had walked back to her push broom as if nothing had happened. It was not closure exactly. It was something more useful than closure. It was the recognition that some debts could not be repaid but could be honored. That the best response to being given something you didn't know you needed was to use it completely and to pass it on. He made a decision standing there on that mountain. Whatever he needed to do when they got home, whatever reports he needed to write and channels he needed to navigate and requests he needed to submit, he was going to find a way to make sure that what Emily Parker had built, the environmental reading methodology, the layered wind assessment approach, the philosophy of natural indicators over instrument dependency, found its way into formal training programs. Not attributed, not named, she would never want it named, but used, carried forward, taught to the next team and the team after that. That was the only tribute she would have accepted, and Carter intended to make sure she received it. The mountain was quiet around them. The valley below held its secrets. The stars overhead were very bright and very cold, and 12 Marines watched the wind and read what it told them and stayed ready. Because that was what she had made them. Ready, they came home on a Thursday. Not with fanfare, not with the kind of homecoming that gets photographed and posted and turned into the public record of sacrifice honored. They came home the way most of these teams came home, quietly through a side entrance of a military terminal at a time of day when the light was flat and the air tasted like jet fuel and institutional coffee, carrying their gear and their bodies and everything the deployment had put inside them that hadn't been there before. Carter was the last one off the aircraft. He stood at the top of the ramp for a moment before he descended, looking at the tarmac, at the low buildings of the base, at the California sky. That was exactly the color it always was, and yet somehow looked different than it had 11 weeks ago, when he had last stood under it. He breathed in, he breathed out. 12 men, all of them standing on that tarmac. He descended the ramp. The processing took 3 hours. Medical checks, equipment, accounting, initial debrief, scheduling, the administrative machinery of return, that ran parallel to the emotional machinery, and often at cross purposes with it. Carter moved through all of it with the automatic competence of a man who had done this before and knew that the bureaucracy of coming home was simply the tax you paid for the fact of being home to pay it. Walsh was waiting for him outside the final processing station. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the hallway, and he extended one toward Carter with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who had decided to do something without overthinking it. Carter took it. "Thank you." "Yes, Gunny." They stood in the hallway for a moment. The coffee was bad. Neither of them mentioned it. "How are you?" Carter asked. Walsh considered the question with more seriousness than Carter expected. "Different," he said finally. "I keep looking at things, wind stuff, environmental things. I was in the parking lot waiting for the shuttle and I spent 15 minutes reading the dust movement between the vehicles." He paused. "My wife's going to think something's wrong with me." "Tell her you learned to pay attention to things that were always there," Carter said. "She'll probably agree that's an improvement." Walsh almost smiled. It reached his eyes slightly. "Gunny, the maintenance lady, Emily Parker." He said the name carefully as if he was deciding whether he had the right to use it. "Do you think she knows that it worked, that we—" He stopped, rephrased. "Do you think she knows we came home?" Carter looked at him. He thought about the secure messages in theater, about real-time wind data delivered from an unknown location to a mountain halfway around the world, about 2 words sent into a channel with no confirmation of receipt. "Yes," Carter said, "I think she knows." Walsh nodded slowly. "Good," he said, "just that, just good." And the weight he put into that single syllable carried everything. He couldn't assemble into a longer sentence. The apology he'd never been able to deliver in person, the respect that had replaced the dismissal, the gratitude of a man who understood now what had been given to him by someone he had mocked in front of an audience, and who had not reacted because she'd already decided he was worth saving anyway. Carter clapped him once on the shoulder and walked toward the exit. The base felt familiar and slightly foreign, at the same time the way home always feels after you've been somewhere that changed you. Carter drove to his quarters, showered, changed, and sat at his desk with a legal pad and a pen and began writing. Not a letter, not a report, a proposal. I had made a decision on a mountain under coal stars, and he was not a man who made decisions and then forgot them in the transition back to ordinary life. The decision had traveled home with him the same way everything else had packed in and inseparable from the person he now was. He wrote for 2 hours. He was not a natural writer. He was a precise thinker who expressed himself most fluently in action and in the spoken word. In translating the precision of what he was trying to say into written language required effort. But he worked at it the way he worked at everything, patiently and repeatedly, until what was on the page said what he meant it to say. What he was proposing was a formal training module, environmental awareness methodology for scout sniper teams, multi-layer wind reading using natural indicators, the integration of environmental observation with ballistic calculation, the philosophy of patience, of reading the window rather than forcing the shot. He wrote the technical sections with the confidence of someone who now had operational proof that the methodology worked. He wrote the contextual sections, the reasons this capability mattered, the scenarios in which it would be decisive with the particular authority of a man who had watched it save lives and knew precisely which lives it had saved. What he did not write was her name, not because he wanted to erase her contribution. The opposite. He did not write her name because Emily Parker was the kind of professional whose work was designed to be untraceable, and honoring that design was its own form of respect. The methodology could be attributed to operational experience. The proposal would go through his chain of command, and eventually, if he did his job well, into training program design offices and curriculum development teams in the machinery of institutional change that moved slowly, but moved. He titled the proposal simply Environmental Reading Integration for Long-Range Precision Teams. He dated it and signed it and set it aside to review in the morning with fresh eyes. Then he pulled out the card. He had carried it for 11 weeks, through California and transit and theater and back, through operational decisions and mountain nights and the particular interior weather of a deployment that tests everything a person is and shows them what remains. He looked at the seal. He looked at the name. He put it back in his pocket and went to sleep. The after-action debrief happened 2 days later. Formal setting conference room, the full machinery of post-deployment assessment. Carter's team gave their accounts in sequence, each man building on the previous, the collective picture of the deployment assembling itself across the table with the methodical thoroughness that the Marine Corps applied to learning from every operation. When Carter presented his section command decision-making team performance outcomes, he included a specific passage about the environmental reading methodology and its operational impact. He was precise about the numbers. 3 critical engagements where multi-layer wind reading had been the decisive factor. Engagement ranges and conditions that would have produced failure under conventional ballistic methodology. Results achieved through patient environmental observation and window identification. The senior officer running the debrief, a colonel named Ashworth, who had 30 years in, and the particular quality of stillness that came from having heard a very large number of operational accounts and learned to identify which ones contained something genuinely new, leaned forward when Carter reached this section. Multi-layer wind reading, Ashworth said, using natural indicators. This is not a standard element of the pre-deployment training curriculum. No, sir. Where did your team develop this capability? Carter had prepared for this question. He had thought about how to answer it honestly, without disclosing what he was not authorized to disclose, and he had arrived at language that satisfied both requirements. Pre-deployment supplementary training at 29 Palms, Carter said. Our team encountered an on-site consultant with significant expertise in environmental reading methodology. The encounter was unscheduled and informal. The methodology was demonstrated under live conditions and produced immediate measurable results. We integrated it into our preparation in the 9 days before deployment. Ashworth looked at him steadily. Unscheduled and informal. Yes, sir. And this consultant, who were they attached to? Carter held Ashworth's gaze. I'm not in a position to go further than contractor support, sir. The room was quiet for a moment. Ashworth had enough experience to know when he was encountering something that had clearance implications above his immediate authority in this context. His expression registered this without reacting to it. The methodology, Ashworth said, is it documentable, teachable? Yes, sir. I've drafted a formal proposal, environmental reading integration for long-range precision teams. I'd like to submit it through the appropriate channels for training program consideration. Ashworth looked at him for a long moment. Around the table, other officers were paying attention with the particular alertness that surfaces when something in a debrief breaks out of the expected pattern and reveals something the institution might actually be able to use. Submit it, Ashworth said. I'll review it personally. Yes, sir. The debrief continued. When it concluded and the room was clearing, Ashworth stopped Carter at the door. Carter, he said quietly, away from the other officers still gathering their materials at the table. Sir. Ashworth looked at him with the direct assessment of a man who had decided to say something he wouldn't include in any official record. The consultant, he said. Contractor support. He paused. In my experience, contractor support doesn't usually produce training methodologies that hold up operationally at the level your team just demonstrated. Carter said nothing. I'm not asking you to go further than you already have, Ashworth said. I'm telling you that whatever you're protecting, it held up. And the proposal you've written is going to be better received than you might expect, because the training gap you're describing is one that people above my level have been trying to address for a while without finding an approach that actually works in complex terrain. Carter absorbed this. Thank you, sir. Ashworth nodded. He started to move past, then stopped once more. The consultant, he said without looking directly at Carter, if they ever become available in a formal capacity advisory curriculum development, anything the pathway for that kind of engagement exists. The interest is there at the program level. He walked out. Carter stood in the doorway of the empty conference room and considered what Ashworth had just told him. He thought about Emily Parker in her small office with her cold coffee, moving on to whatever came after her 14 months of invisible work. He thought about the vehicle pulling away from the range. He thought about the secure messages from a mountain he couldn't locate on any map he had access to. He pulled out his secure device. He opened the message channel. He typed a message he wasn't sure would be received. He wrote Colonel Ashworth, post-deployment debrief, expressed interest in formal advisory engagement for training program development. Pathway exists if you're ever in a position to consider it. The proposal is in. Your methodology is going to outlast both of us. He sent it. He pocketed the device and walked out of the building into the California afternoon. 4 weeks passed. The team settled into the particular rhythm of post-deployment life, the readjustment, the recalibration, the slow reassembly of a civilian self that had been in storage while the operational self was running at full capacity. Some men found this transition easy. Others found it the hardest part. Carter checked on each of them individually, not in formal settings, but in the informal way of a leader who understood that the real state of his people revealed itself in unguarded moments rather than official ones. Brooks was teaching his younger brother to shoot on weekends. He was incorporating the environmental reading methodology into the instruction explaining to a 19-year-old in a field in North Carolina. Why the way the grass moved at the edge of the tree line told him more than any wind gauge could. His brother thought he'd gone slightly strange. Brooks didn't mind. Reyes had written 3 pages of notes, personal notes, exactly as Carter had suggested, documenting his observations about the way the training had been designed. He gave them to Carter in a sealed envelope without explanation. Carter read them and understood what Reyes had understood, and added the key observations to the proposal's supporting documentation without attribution. Walsh had done the thing Carter had least expected. Walsh had written a letter. Not an email, a handwritten letter on paper in the careful but imperfect handwriting of a man who didn't write letters often and was taking this one seriously. He had addressed it to Emily Parker, care of a government agency address that he had researched with the persistent ingenuity he applied to things he had decided mattered. He didn't know if it would reach her. He sent it anyway. I didn't tell Carter about it until after he'd sent it. He mentioned it one morning at the range during a training session, almost as an aside in the same tone he might use to mention that he'd gotten a haircut. I wrote her a letter, Walsh said, the maintenance lady. Carter looked at him. I apologize, Walsh said, for the thing I said at the range when she first spoke up and I made the janitor comment. He paused. I said what I meant, that she's the best operator I've ever been around, and I was too stupid to see it when she was standing right in front of me, and that the people who underestimate her should know she's out there somewhere, and they'll never see her coming, and that's entirely their problem. Carter was quiet for a moment. Did you get a response? Not yet. Walsh shrugged with a studied casualness that didn't quite conceal how much a response would mean. Maybe not ever. That's okay. She doesn't owe me anything. I just needed to say it. He paused. Some things need to be said, even when you're not sure anyone's listening. Carter looked at him for a long moment. Walsh had traveled a significant distance in 11 weeks. The man who had said the janitor comment in front of 12 people without apparent hesitation was gone, replaced by someone who understood in the bone-deep way that real experience produces that the measure of a person was not visible in their uniform or their title or their position in any room. Good letter, Carter said. Walsh nodded once. Yes, Gunny. The proposal cleared Carter's chain of command 6 weeks after he submitted it. It moved faster than he had expected, which confirmed what Ashworth had said about the interest level at the program level. It was reviewed by a training design office, revised by a curriculum committee, piloted with 2 teams at 29 Palms, and formally approved for incorporation into the Advanced Scout Sniper pre-deployment curriculum within 4 months of submission. The day Carter received the confirmation, he sat at his desk and read the official language of the approval and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A quality of satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of operational success. Operational success was immediate and physical and visible. This was slower, quieter. It was the satisfaction of knowing that something true had been given a form that would allow it to survive the moment of its origin and keep working long after the people involved had moved on. The methodology was in the curriculum now. Every Scout Sniper team that trained at 29 Palms going forward would learn to read multi-layer wind environments through natural indicators. They would learn patience over urgency, observation over instrument dependence. The philosophy of the window finding the alignment instead of forcing the shot. They would learn it as established technique, incorporated into the official program, attributed to operational experience. They would not know her name. They would not know about the gray uniform or the push broom or 14 months of invisible presence or the shot that hit a steel plate at 1,700 yards on a day when 237 rounds had failed to come close. They would not know about the card with the government seal or the secure messages from an unidentifiable location on a mountain halfway around the world. They would simply receive the knowledge, and the knowledge would work, and the teams that carried it into complex terrain would come home in numbers that were slightly higher than they would have been otherwise, and none of them would ever be able to point to the specific source of the edge that made the difference. That was exactly the way Emily Parker would have wanted it. Carter was at his desk reading the approval documentation when his secure device buzzed. One message, same channel, no sender identification. He looked at it, saw the curriculum approval. Well done. The methodology is now larger than either of us. That's the only outcome worth working for. Carter read it twice. He set the device down, he picked it up again and read it a third time. Then he typed back. He didn't think long about what to say. He had known what he wanted to say since the mountain, since the coal stars, since the moment he had understood what 14 months of invisible work actually looked like. When you finally had the perspective to see its full shape. He wrote, "It started with one shot. You turned it into something that will keep saving people who will never know your name. I know your name. So does my team. That's enough." He sent it. He waited. 60 seconds passed. 90. 2 minutes. Then the last message he would ever receive on that channel. 4 words. That's always been enough. Carter held the device in his hand for a long time. He sat in his office in the flat California light and held it and thought about everything those 4 words contained. The career behind them, the years of invisible work, the 14 months on one base, and however many months on however many other bases before that, in gray uniforms and ordinary clothes, in the particular discipline of a person who had committed to being unseen, because unseen was where the work was. That's always been enough. He set the device down. He picked up the legal pad where the original proposal had been drafted, covered now in his careful handwriting, and the crossing out and the revision that turned raw thought into something transmissible. He looked at it, then he put it in a drawer that he locked with a key he kept on his person. He stood up. He walked out of his office and down the corridor to the range where his team was running an afternoon training session. He could hear them from the hallway, the controlled sounds of professional work equipment being handled and checked, the terse professional communication of men who had trained together long enough that their operational language had become compressed and efficient. He pushed open the door. Brooks was at the firing position. Reyes was spotting. Walsh was standing at the edge of the range with his arms crossed and his eyes moving across the terrain with a habitual automatic environmental reading that had become over the past months as natural to him as breathing. Walsh saw Carter first. "Gunny, wind's doing something interesting today. Come look." Carter walked to where Walsh was standing. Walsh pointed across the range. "Surface wind is coming right, but look at the flag at 800 meters. It's barely moving, and the heat shimmer about halfway down is bending left." He paused. 3 layers, same as always. "What does that tell you?" Carter asked. "That there's a crosswind at mid-range that's invisible from here. If you fire on the surface read, you're going to pull left at about 500 meters. You need to wait for the alignment." Walsh looked at him, same as always. Carter looked at him. At this man who had traveled from janitor comment to handwritten letter and everything in between. At this man who was standing on a range in California reading the invisible movement of air with the fluency of someone who had been doing it his whole life, when in fact he had been doing it for less than 5 months. "Same as always," Carter agreed. He stayed at the range for the rest of the afternoon. He watched his team work. He watched them apply without prompting, without reminders, without any external pressure. The methodology that a woman in a gray uniform had given them on a September afternoon when they had been failing for 3 hours and didn't know what they didn't know. He watched Brooks find the window and take the shot and connect. He watched Reyes confirm the hit with the quiet satisfaction of a spotter who trusted his shooter and trusted the read. He watched Walsh keep watching, keep reading, keep seeing the invisible things that the terrain was saying to anyone patient enough to listen. And Carter thought about Emily Parker, wherever she was, whatever uniform she was wearing now, whatever name was on, whatever badge she was carrying, in whatever installation she was moving through with a push broom or a clipboard or nothing at all, just herself in a space where no one was looking at her. He thought about her watching a different team in a different place, reading them the way she read everything with the complete, impatient attention of a person who understood that the most important things were always happening just below the level where most people looked. He hoped she was well. He hoped the work was sustaining her the way work sustains people who have built their lives around something larger than recognition or reward. He hoped that somewhere in whatever way was available to her, she knew that 12 men went overseas and came home, and the training she had designed for their specific needs in their specific environment had held up under the conditions she had anticipated and prepared them for. I thought she probably knew. She seemed to know most things. The afternoon training session ended at 1700. The team broke down their equipment with the efficient familiarity of long practice. Carter did a final walk of the range the way he always did, checking positions and retrieving anything left behind. At the maintenance locker bay, the push broom was in its place, leaning against the wall. It had been there since September. Nobody had moved it. Nobody had used it. It had simply been there, ordinary and unremarkable and invisible in the way of all ordinary things. Carter stopped in front of it. He stood there for a moment. Then he picked it up, carried it to the equipment bay, and hung it properly on its hook. He closed the bay door. He stood outside it for a second. He walked back to the range. Behind him, the base was settling into the sounds of evening. Training complete. Day ending. The ordinary machinery of life at a military installation. Cycling through its routines, unremarkable and continuous. The background against which significant things occasionally occurred and were absorbed and became part of what the place knew about itself. Carter reached his vehicle. He stood beside it for a moment with his hand on the door handle, looking back at the range complex, at the firing positions, at the targets downrange, at the valley beyond where the air was doing what it always did, moving in layers, complex and invisible, speaking its constant language to anyone who had learned to listen. His team had learned to listen. Whatever they faced next, they would listen. They would read the environment. They would wait for the window. They would trust what they observed and distrust what they assumed, and hold the line between patience and urgency with the particular discipline of people who had been taught by the best. Carter opened his vehicle door and got in. He reached into his front pocket. The card was there. It had been there for 5 months. He pulled it out and looked at it one final time. The seal, the name, the designation that spoke volumes to people with clearance and said nothing to everyone else. Emily Parker, Special Agent, the designation below. He looked at it, then he put it back. Not because he needed to keep it, because he had decided that some things deserved to be carried. He started the engine. He drove off the range. And somewhere in the world, in a location that could not be tracked and would not be found, a woman who had never needed anyone to know her name continued to do the invisible work that kept people alive and asked nothing in return except that the people she saved used what she gave them. She was already there. She was already watching. She was already reading the wind. And the next team that thought they were alone on a training range, struggling with a problem they couldn't solve, watched by no one they would ever think to notice, that team had no idea what was standing quietly in the background, waiting for the exact moment when what it knew could change everything. That was the lesson. That had always been the lesson. The most dangerous, most capable, most consequential person in any room is not always the one who announces themselves. Sometimes they carry a push broom. Sometimes they wait. And when the moment comes, they take one shot and they do not miss.